I don't, thank you. I don't want to delay because this is really a deep dive and a follow-up to the initial presentation that we had on the 28th. If you will see on the next slide, we'll be following the same process in that anytime you have questions, please put it in the chat. Dr. Hendrick will be taking pause throughout to check in and see where there are questions to relevant parts of the conversation. And we'll be moderating those questions. So when you put it in the chat, and when we take a pause for questions, we'll acknowledge you and ask you to read or state your question because it may have been answered during the presentation, but we'll give you the opportunity to frame that as appropriate. And also a reminder that this section on access and reach is sort of the innovations extra, right? So part of our new things that we were going to do, we asked them to really do an analysis of what we needed to do to fully access our access and reach. And not only did they access and kind of give us analysis of what other data points we need, they also made a good progress, right? In turning that into remind everyone, this is a first step when we start talking about access and reach. And this is really to help us be prepared as we go into strategic planning and look forward to the next 5 years of how we extend our levy out in the next phase for us. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Hendrick.
All right, thank you so much, Shara. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, great. And Shara, you basically captured what I was going to open up this presentation with, just setting the stage. You know, one of our deliverables was to assist CPP in answering some of these key questions related to reach and access. So we're going to present some data and some maps for your consideration and to have some conversation. Again, this was not a part of any formal report. We hope that we are going to answer some questions, but we know that there may be some additional questions raised throughout. So the first question we thought about was, where do preschool age children in Cincinnati live? So here we have a table of the top 5 neighborhoods that have the largest preschool age populations. And this would be as of 2019-20. And the reason we're looking at that year is because this data comes from the 2020-21 CPS kindergarten entry cohort, right? So those kids that just came into kindergarten at the beginning of that year, we use those addresses to represent where they were as preschoolers. So we see the top 5 neighborhoods. The second column is separating those children who attended either a CPP community preschool or a CPS preschool. The third column are those children who came to CPS kindergarten with no documented preschool experience. What that means for this sample is that they had not attended CPP community preschool or a CPS preschool. And then we have the total number of preschool age children from those neighborhoods. And then we also wanted to look at these children on a map so we could actually see where they live, to examine whether there are any clusters or any stories that came out of this map. So what we're looking at, we have the quality gap neighborhoods that are shaded in pink, and the blue dots represent those preschoolers. I'm just going to call them CPP preschoolers going forward. They're the CPP preschoolers. The yellow dots represent those non-CPP preschoolers. So at first glance, I thought, wow, they are really clustered around the same neighborhoods, except I did notice on the east side, there seemed to be more of a concentration of those children who don't have any preschool experience. So Peter thought it was a great idea to take a look at these maps separated by socioeconomic status. So this is the same map, but these are the children who would be considered in SES 1 and 2 neighborhoods. These are the neighborhoods that have lower incomes. They are associated with more of those risks determined by the American Community Survey. So you can see a little bit of a tighter cluster when we look at it this way. So this is where the low SES kids live. This map shows where the higher SES kids live, those in SES 3 and 4. And that's where you really see, they're kind of more on the outskirts of those neighborhoods. You see a lot represented in some of those eastern neighborhoods. Those are Hyde Park, Oakley, Mount Lookout, the kids who are in those higher SES brackets. So we thought it was interesting to look at the whole and then just try to understand as we break down SES, are there any other patterns that emerge? So the next question we wanted to address was, where are the high quality preschool sites? So here we're looking at another table, lists the top 5 neighborhoods, most densely populated neighborhoods by preschoolers. Then the next 3 rows separate the types of high quality preschools. So the first column, we have CPP, TA community preschools. Then we have CPS preschools. And this other column is those high quality preschools that are not in the CPP or the CPS network. And then we have the total. So what jumps out at me right away, you look at the CPP community preschool representation. It's the highest number in all of these most densely populated neighborhoods. Another way to think about what's going on with services and where the kids are, I thought it'd be interesting to just understand the ratio of preschoolers in the community, in these neighborhoods, to the number of high quality providers. And actually it's opposite, it's providers to children ratio. So for instance, in Westwood, for every 1 high quality provider, there are 20 preschool age children. Whereas if you look in Avondale, for every 1 high quality provider, there are only 14 preschool age children. This was interesting to me because I know we're having this continuing conversation about what are the quality gap neighborhoods. As of now, Westwood, East Price Hill, West Price Hill, and Avondale are all considered those quality gap neighborhoods, but College Hill is not. But if you look at the ratios in College Hill, you know, that might fit into a quality gap neighborhood. Who knows, does Avondale come out? So I'm not saying this is for sure, but just based on the overarching definition, you know, quality gap is where there's a lack of high quality, a lack of the number of high quality preschools to serve children. So this is something, again, to continue to think about. And then we mapped out.
Are we supposed to put our questions in the chat?
You can go ahead.
So the number of providers does not take into account the number of seats, the number of, so it could be, for instance, that Westwood has a lot of family child care providers that take 3 preschoolers.
Right.
Whereas someplace else might have a couple of large centers that take 60 preschoolers.
That's true. And I was definitely going to mention that, you know, we could further break this down into how many type A, how many type B, you know, how many centers. And that leads to other questions about, you know, capacity and things of that nature. So, yeah, those are additional questions that some of those we might answer going forward, but some of those we'll continue to investigate.
I think that will be particularly important as we start to look forward to determine if we need to make investments to expand the sites that are already there so that they are well equipped. Because we know the challenge that we continue to face is we've invested in seat capacity because many of those are conversion from QI, but they cannot really fulfill that full capacity because they have classrooms that are not open because of staffing challenges. Right. And Absolutely. So that looks very different if we say we're going to invest on the QI side to put new preschool sites there and help them reach high quality, or invest in the ones of high quality to make sure that that access is there for what we've already invested in. So
exactly right. A lot of issues around, you know, getting down to what's going to allow a child to fill that seat. Okay. And this is just a look at where these high quality providers are. They're color coded by type. So blue are the CPPTA community preschools, red are where the CPS preschools are, and then green are those other high quality preschools. The next question we thought about, how close do those preschool age children live to the high quality preschools? So in this table, we're looking at things a couple different ways. The first column is separation by, again, low SES, 1 and 2, and high SES. Then we also want to understand proximity, just to see if there are any differences between those kids who did attend preschool and those who didn't. So if we go, like the fifth column, we can focus on driving time. So we see that within low SES neighborhoods, the difference in driving time to the closest high quality provider, I mean, there's really no difference. They're both under a mile, 0.5 and 0.7 to the closest. But then if we look at where those who attended preschool actually chose to attend, they actually chose sites that are a little further away, about 2.7 miles away from their home. This could be for a variety of reasons. Hearing from parents, we know they place priority on their perception of safety at their chosen provider, at the quality. Does the provider really think about my whole child, not just academic? Another consideration, if that family has an infant that they need care for, does that provider provide infant care? That can be a consideration. Some parents want their provider to be closer to their work, right? So, there's things to think about, but again, still the driving distance isn't very far. And then when you look at the higher SES neighborhoods, not a lot of difference there either. Still under a mile of driving distance. And again, a little over 3 miles to their chosen provider. And then we wanted to look at proximity a different way as well. So this figure shows proximity within different radii. So the first is, how many providers are within 1 mile of the of each preschool family. So within 1 mile, you have between 6 and 8. Within 2 miles, 21 to 17, within 3 miles, you see. So I think the conclusion we're coming to are there high quality providers nearby in the neighborhoods where the kids are clustered? This seems to suggest that they are. So next question, how many preschool age children can Cincinnati Preschool Promise reach?
Dr. Hennick, can we take a break from 1 second and see if there are any other questions related to that first section?
Sure.
Yes, I know I struggle to work my chat feature sometimes, so I want everybody to have a chance to ask questions, even if you didn't get in the chat. Okay, seeing none, I think we're ready for the next question.
Okay. Again, this is about potentially how many preschool age children can CPP reach. So we started by just looking at the whole city of Cincinnati, right? We want to know how many 3 and 4-year-olds are in the city of Cincinnati, and then understand the poverty levels attached to their families. So this data comes from the 2019 American Community Survey, using the 5-year estimates, which are the most precise. They also provide some 1-year estimates. And to our knowledge, there may be another release of this survey later this year, but I think it might only be the 1-year estimate. So this is the most recent data that we could get that was broken down to this level of specificity. So total 3 and 4-year-olds in Cincinnati is about 8,075. If we look at those who are under 300% FPL, that number drops down to about 6,184. And so that's where we're going to focus going forward on these next 3 slides, is really targeting those children who are under 300 FPL. So 6,000 184. So before I get to our next iteration, I just want to make a comment about the RAND report because we are going to be using some of their predictions for the next step. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this report at this time. So RAND conducted a series of reports on preschool in Cincinnati. And one of those reports, they created a 10-year model for expected preschool participation year over year. That model included variables such as program access, eligibility requirements. They looked at public funding, demographics, structure, things of that nature. So in this table, we apply the RAND estimated participation rates for year 5 as CPP is going into year 5 to try to understand how many kids are expected to participate, 3 and 4-year-olds under 300 FPL. So as we apply these rates, you can see in the final column, these are the totals of the children by FPL, by age. So we come up with a total of 3,943. That is 64% of that larger total that we started with on the very first slide. So we thought this might be a representation of participation in a non-pandemic year. None of the variables in the RAND report, of course, COVID-19 wasn't affecting us at that time, were in place. So we need to put things into context with COVID. So our total here, 3,943, we carry forward into this slide. And this is where we consider COVID's impact. If we look at the change in enrollment from 2018 to where we landed at the end of this past fiscal year, the aggregate decrease was about 20.1%. So if we look at the steps, only decreased 11.7 from 2018-19 and 19-20, and then only 9.4 this past academic year. So in totality, about 20%. So we thought, what if we applied this rate decrease to that number to understand what the enrollment target might look like when we're impacted by the pandemic? So we get to 3,150. The next step we did was try to understand, okay, if 3,150 is our target, what is going on in our network now? Can we accommodate that? So currently there are 3,727 quality and high quality seats that are reserved for any preschooler within the CPP network. Those numbers are based on their reported licensure capacity as of June 30th of this year. So if we look there, okay, it looks like we're in pretty good shape to reach that COVID adjusted number. The next number would be what we would consider a target in a non-COVID year if things start to return to normal. There's a bit of a gap. We still need to grow the network a little bit. If you go up to the higher level of all the 3 and 4-year-olds at 300 FPL and less, that number is a little bigger, 6,184. We still have room to grow. And if you just think about the totality of all the preschoolers in the city, of course, that's the large number that we started with, the 8,000. So thinking about all these things, of course, we suggest some strategic planning around program expansion. CPP does this obviously routinely, but thinking about perhaps pursuing some of those high quality providers that already exist in the space, trying to convert them and bringing along their preschoolers too. But then also continuing to pursue current and precise data. So again, I mentioned some of this data that we use today was from the 2019-2020 year. There are new estimates continuously coming out from the census, from the American Community Survey. And there are other sources that we're continuing to try to connect with. For instance, 4C has been very wonderful and helpful with providing some data. And jointly, we're trying to get some information from ODJFS about PFCC participation rate, so we can understand that bigger picture. So there's still some additional steps to take, as Shara mentioned, but we just wanted to start this conversation. I hope we advanced it a little bit, showing the data that we had and some of the resources that we were able to put together. So I will pause here for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hendred. If you could go back specifically, because I think our initial question, there are a couple questions in the chat, to the slide that talks about the assumptions that were made in the RAND report. And Sally, I see that you have a question or a comment about RAND, if you'd like to share.
Okay, could you go to the next slide? Yeah. So I believe a couple of things about this chart. And since you've used this to sort of project estimates, I think that we ought to go back to the rationale behind some of these numbers and really adjust them. Now, I know that 200 to 300% is a relatively small number relative to the lower income, but those participation rates that were predicted are extraordinarily high in the 200 to 300. I mean, I would take that down to, I don't know, 20%. I'm just making that number up. But the higher the income, the less likely people are to participate in government programs. So those 54 and 77% are way off and would reduce the numbers. The other thing is, if we think about the preschool promise tuition assistance families, tuition assistance is a funding source. It's not whether they have preschool or not. It's where their funding comes from. And I think if our goal is to ensure that all children can afford, all families can afford high quality preschool, we can't just look at take-up rates of the preschool promise. We have to assess the community for what else is out there. I know Laura put something about CPS there. They have dozens, I don't know, that's an exaggeration, of funding sources that cover the cost and don't need CPP. So anyway, I think these to use the RAND numbers as the basis for the projections is always going to give us way higher numbers than is reasonable for us to as a goal. And it will always look like we're dramatically short of our goal, whereas it's the wrong goal.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And a part of what we were trying to do, we know PFCC, we know their ODE funds, their Head Start funds. We were trying to, before this presentation, get more data on what that looks like so we could exclude, because we do know CPP's last dollar in after all those funding sources. We were trying to get enough data so that we can make projections about how many kids to exclude that wouldn't even qualify for CPP. So that's one of those next steps that we're trying to get more information on that. So that makes total sense. Yeah, and those comments are definitely valid.
Yeah, I'd say from about 150 up, we ought to lower our expectations because people don't want to bother with the paperwork, et cetera, if they can almost afford it.
That makes sense.
What I would like to suggest to consider is, would the data and evaluation work group take on looking at making recommendations to the board, particularly as we're starting to consider our strategic planning process? Another way that we may look at and estimate participation rates, because as you know, we have to look forward for the next 5 years as well. And I think that may be a good place for us to start with the data that we have. And I have some concerns about how we get to that number without commissioning another RAND report. Right.
I think we may have to just look at the assumptions that were made in RAND and to see where we think they are now in hindsight inaccurate, and then make our own assumptions based on however many years experience we've had, 5 years experience.
And I think there is sufficient expertise on that data and evaluation work group to come forward with a strong recommendation, particularly since we have till April when the strategic planning process actually happens for that full day. I also want to acknowledge some other questions that are in the chat, both from Laura San Regret and from Tony Hobson. And those are, Laura, would you like to pose your question or recommendation?
When we are looking at these numbers, you are taking into account the CPS preschools, all of them, not just the CPP funded preschools, but all of our preschools, and how many we service.
So if you look at if you'll advance, Dr. Hinder, to the chart, and correct me if I'm wrong, when we start looking at the seats that we have available in high quality, this is only community provider. So for
that's right.
Of availability seats, of course, we would need to add CPS. Right now, we are just showing the community provider seat availability.
Right.
Yeah, at this time, we don't really have the CPS seats.
So so basically for CPS, it would be the number of classrooms times 20. So I don't think that can, I think that could be found very, very easily. But I just was making sure with knowing that we are looking to service 3,100 plus children, that we take into account, because like Sally said, some of our students don't even get CPP funding because they have both Head Start and ODE fund. So, but if you look at that, that would take away some of that for numbers. Now, since being in this pandemic, I agree that the RAND report with Sally it was just a little too much. They were overestimated, and I agree. But I do think that now parents who might have just barely been able to afford childcare, if they can get some subsidy, even though they are at 200 or 300%, they're going to look for it, because in my opinion, from coming from the Montessori sector of CPS, where most of ours could afford the tuition, we always had at least, out of 70 preschoolers, I would say we'd have at least 7 preschool parents who were asking about Preschool Promise and how they could, and you knew that they were too high to get the full amount, but they wanted, and at that time we didn't have it when I was in the classroom. So I can see that that's, at least from the personnel, from my standpoint, I could see that. But I do believe that the RAND report was a little way off.
Yeah, a little way off.
A little way off, yeah.
And but I think if you look into how many children we have in CPS, I think that the service number is I think you're gonna be surprised at how many we are already serving. And I think that would be a very good thing to take into account. And I'd be happy to help with that.
That would be great.
That'd be great. Yes.
And I think I want to be clear that this is not, none of this is actual numbers that we're serving, right? That is not what this chart is showing.
Right.
And Tony, I saw that you also had a question in the chat as well.
Yeah, let me get off mute. Well, I guess it begs the question, it is part of our mission to encourage higher participation. If we've got 8,000 3- and 4-year-olds in Cincinnati, do we want all of them to attend high quality preschool? That answer is yes, right? We want them all to attend.
Right. That answers.
And if we have almost 30, well, what's the number of 300% and below? 6,000. What was
6,184.
And we certainly want all 6,000 of those kids to attend high quality preschool. And so, I agree, the participation rate, who knows what it really is, but man, we know it sort of really is, but we certainly want to think about how do we get 6,184 of those kids in a high quality seat. And I think you got to look at Cincinnati Public School as a critical part of that equation.
Right.
You know, there are 3,700 in the CPP community, right? 3,700 seats. So I'd be curious, Laura, do you have even a wild guess of what you think CPS has?
Trying to, off the top of my head, when I was in that department, we had, I would say, 42 traditional preschool Head Start classrooms. Those would be times 20. And we probably had 25 to 30 preschool disabilities classrooms. And that would be, they could usually be 12 a classroom. So, I mean, and that was then.
1,200, call it 1,500. So the total capacity, you know, in our community is 5,500, something like that. Total capacity.
Right. Yep. 1,200.
And I think, as you said, we could find that number as in what capacity is. I want to be careful though about if everybody's operating at capacity. And I think to respond to your question, Tony, I think the way that our mission, that it was reflected in increasing participation, is one that we would try to maximize enrollment and attendance at whatever number we targeted that to be. But also part of our mission is elevating the conversation and stressing the importance of early childhood education to influence and encourage people to enroll no matter their income level, right? And no matter their neighborhood status. So that's part of the mission that we drive to. That's kind of a squishy thing that you say, how do you do that? And how do you measure our effectiveness if when doing that, when the reality is we have no way of capturing where everybody is and how many students are enrolled, right? We have a way of capturing it on the CPS side. We don't have a way of capturing it for all parochial schools. We definitely don't have a way of capturing it for all private community providers, particularly the ones that don't accept publicly funded childcare. Yeah. So that means that we have an idea. We can determine what their licensure capacity may be if we pull all the records, and 4C helped us do that. But when we start talking about schools, there's always going to be a margin of unknown, but we may be able to narrow that, right, as we move forward. And part of that is we are consistently decreasing the number of high quality providers in the footprint that are not a part of the network, right? There are probably less than 20 providers that are high quality community providers that are not in some way in a touch in our network. And you'll see that there are very strategic outreach efforts that we're doing to try to get those in the fold so that we can talk about and particularly look at something that I think Sally really helped me kind of see is, what does a footprint wide registry look like? Right? What does it look like to have everybody engaged in the preschoolers and know where they are? Because I think that's the only way that we're going to get to the increased participation. Because unless we go to 500 of FPL, which the master agreement does allow us to do if the board decided to recommend that in their strategic planning process, there are always going to be some kids we're not going to touch. I don't know if that was responsive, Tony, or not.
No, it is, and it's a, and it kind of goes back to where Sally started. When you look at these numbers and you say, "Whoa, how could we be serving 800 kids when there's 6,000 of them?" But when you think about who's actually attending or who is actually going to attend, those numbers become much more. I don't know. It's a different story, but it almost begs that second question. Well, then how do we get the rest of them in there? You know, how do we make it better than 20% participation? You know, how do we convince people that quality preschool is an important part of their children's life?
One of the things that that speaks to that, and I think that Shara was just addressing it, is things, perhaps the greatest impact of the preschool promise would be creating a culture of valuing preschool in this community. And if there are other funding sources for families, if there are other ways to make it grow, and we're out there with the drumbeat about how important it is and talk about getting every family access, if we aren't the big funder of actual tuition assistance or the biggest funder, but we have created this culture in the community where parents want to go and find ways to go, we have a certain significant level of success. And when we tell our story, yes, last dollar in is a very, very important part of our story, but it's not the whole story. And we don't want to be defined by simply the number of children who get financial assistance. You know, we sort of want to be defined at how much quality is there? How does it match up with family needs? And are we getting to the goal of having, as Tony, you're saying, every child, every family who wants high quality preschool has access to it?
Yeah, I think it's a significant number that we haven't captured in the past that we're looking to now is how many kids are in our quality improvement providers that are just waiting, right? As we move in that process to really have a high quality education, and they're working on it and they're getting a significantly better education every day because of those efforts. And I think, you know, I have to say a thanks to the board in letting me kind of expand a little bit and talk about the role that the Preschool Promise plays in an advocacy agenda. And that advocacy is in terms of public education and heightening awareness on what quality means and how important it is and the impact it has for our region. Because the conversation that I always lead with is, if we are not having this discussion about quality and every child having access, not just tuition assistant, you as a taxpayer are not getting your money's worth. So help us make sure that you get your money's worth and everybody can access quality, right? There were lots of questions just to include board members in yesterday at the CPS board meeting about what's going to happen with universal preschool, right? And how that may impact the work that we do. And so at every opportunity, I think this is a good one to talk about reach and access, because that's our topic, to make sure that people understand that it's crucial that we have a mixed delivery model, that any funds that come for universal preschool will be applicable not only to a public school classroom, but also to a community provider. And that if this appropriation in dollars follow anything that we've seen in the past, it is left to the states to determine how that money will be distributed. So people should not be, we should be encouraged by a federal investment, but the rubber really meets the road when we get to the state and determine how that will be distributed. And when people ask me for projections, I think we're at least a couple years off and looking at seeing what the impact of those dollars will have. So, all right, I'll open it up to more questions. I could talk forever. All right, seeing none, I would like to take our go forward steps from this as a report back, is that taking all these questions that were asked, the recommendations from this conversation, advancing those to the data and evaluation work group, and asking that at their next meeting, we come back with sort of a game plan and a strategy and a timeline to share with the board on how we may reconsider what our projections will be. At this point, I will take all of this in consideration as I start to boil down and set our target numbers of what our tuition assistance numbers will be in terms of our goals and strategies again, because those will be presented to the board in November for consideration and our goals for this year, knowing that this informed it may not have every answer, but we know the additional data pieces and work that we need to do to bring us to that. What we will also make sure that we have is an estimation from CPS of the number of high quality seats currently capacity, but also as part of your strategic plan and growth. I know at the last finance and growth committee meeting that board member, a few board members actually recommended to the treasurer that they look at what the plans were for additional classrooms in the upcoming years. And if the plans are happening for that, that may be a good topic of discussion for our upcoming joint meeting to talk about how we're going to collectively plan for any increased classrooms and seats. Right? Because if they're planning and budgeting for that, in terms of where quality gap neighborhoods, where community providers are in QI, what we're actually targeting for seat capacity based on that map that you presented, Dr. Hinder, I think it will be important to have a collective discussion there, because we don't want to create a situation where there are a glut of seats that creates a competition and not availability. I think the next is that we will ask innovations to drill down on that chart that shows the ratio of providers to students to give an estimate of what that equates to in seat capacity, right? Because if we have 20 providers that are all family childcare providers that are type Bs, we're talking about 160 seats, right? Versus what more seats. And so having a snapshot of that will also help us get a bigger handle on seat capacity. Right? Someone else? Board members, do you have any additional follow-ups, questions, inquiries you'd like to know? Okay. With that, I say thank you all for participating. We'll be doing this again tomorrow, twice more for the next 2 topics. I will see some of you this afternoon, Sally and others for Master Agreement Committee. And thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.